Frameworks for understanding all of this are not wrong. Roman concrete is well understood now, at least in terms of its composition. The Paris quarry system has been studied for centuries. The underground structures of Edinburgh are documented, visited, enjoyed. Everything here has an explanation. What is worth noting, however, is a quality that persists when you look at the record closely. The explanations tend to be categorical rather than comprehensive. They identify the type of thing that was found: Roman road, medieval quarry, Norman foundations, without always accounting for specific anomalies within those categories. The dating is sometimes confident in ways the underlying evidence does not fully support, and the physical objects themselves, in case after case, are destroyed before comprehensive study is possible, because the project above ground cannot wait. There is a phrase used in archaeology called salvage excavation. It refers to the practice of rapidly documenting a site before it is destroyed by development. Salvage excavation is common. It is the norm in major urban construction projects worldwide. The phrase implies something about the relationship between the thing being salvaged and the thing doing the salvaging. One is being preserved in record because it cannot be preserved in reality. The record is the best that can be offered, and what this means in practical terms is that our knowledge of what exists beneath most major cities is, to a significant degree, a knowledge of records made in haste, during active construction, by people whose primary obligation was to the project and not to the history. Consider the city of Ankara, the capital of Turkey. When construction began on a major infrastructure project beneath the city centre in the early 2000s and 10s, workers uncovered a Phrygian settlement that pushed the established occupation of the site back by roughly 1,000 years. Fine, cities are old, but beneath the Phrygian settlement were stone foundations that the archaeologists on site were initially unable to identify. The foundations were cut from a volcanic stone, found naturally in a region several hundred kilometers away. This is not, in itself, impossible, but it requires transport, which requires infrastructure, which requires civilization, and the foundations were stratigraphically below the Phrygian layer, which is to say, they were older. How much older? The reports do not specify with confidence. The excavation notes describe the foundations as showing signs of substantial wear, suggesting heavy use over a long period, and then abandonment before the Phrygian occupation built above them. Nobody built on those foundations. They built over them, without using them. This is the strange part. If you encounter a sound stone foundation, the logic of construction is to use it. The fact that the Phrygian builders did not use it, that they built over it, leaving it as an independent layer, suggests either that they did not know what it was, or that there was some reason not to incorporate it, or, and this is the possibility that tends not to make it into official reports, that the foundation was already there when they arrived, and they had no connection to the people who built it. In Egypt, a country whose ancient architectural legacy is better studied than almost any other on Earth, there is an ongoing and somewhat uncomfortable conversation among certain archaeologists about what might be called the substrate problem. The pyramids of Giza, the temple complexes at Karnak, the great administrative centers of the New Kingdom, these are well documented, extensively studied, and their builders are known. But beneath several of these structures, and in some cases incorporated into them, are stones whose cut precision exceeds what the tools of the period should have been able to produce. The Egyptologist Mark Lehner, who spent decades studying the Giza Plateau, has written carefully and honestly about the fact that certain joints in the casing stones of the Great Pyramid are fitted so closely that a knife blade cannot be inserted between them. The official explanation is that these joints were achieved through grinding, patient, repeated grinding of stone on stone until a flat surface was produced. This is mechanically plausible. It is also an explanation that assumes an extraordinary investment of time and labor for what are, in engineering terms, unnecessary levels of precision. A pyramid stands without sub-millimeter joints. It stands quite well with rougher surfaces. Why achieve that precision? The answer is usually that it reflects cultural values, aesthetic priorities, religious significance, and again, this may be entirely correct, but there is a pattern here that runs from the sewers of ancient Rome to the quarry tunnels of Paris, to the foundation stones of Ankara, to the joints of Giza, and the pattern is this. At each site, the oldest layer is frequently the most precise, the most technically accomplished, the most difficult to explain with the tools assigned to it by the historical record. If there was a body of knowledge about stone, about water management, about foundation engineering, about construction at scale that was old before Rome, old before Greece, old before the civilizations we typically describe as ancient, then the question of how that knowledge was transmitted becomes interesting. We tend to think of knowledge transmission in terms of documents, texts, records, written traditions, and for most of human history, written traditions are exactly how we track the movement of ideas. But there is another form of transmission that is much older and in many ways more resilient, the building itself. A building made well, made with the right materials in the right configuration, teaches the next person who encounters it simply by existing. You can look at a well-cut stone and understand that precise cutting is possible. You can look at a vault that has held weight for centuries and understand that the arch works. The building is a demonstration. The building is an argument. And what would follow from this is that if you wanted to preserve technical knowledge across a period of collapse, across a gap in civilization, you would not need to preserve the text explaining the technique. You would need to preserve the example. You would need the building to still be standing. There is a text that circulates in medieval Islamic scholarship called the Book of the Balance of Wisdom, written by Al-Khazini in the 12th century. In it, the author discusses methods for determining the density of materials with remarkable precision, methods that, when examined, appear to draw on an older body of knowledge that Al-Khazini himself describes as inherited rather than invented. He cites sources that no longer exist. He attributes techniques to scholars whose original works have been lost. This is not unusual for medieval Islamic science. One of the great intellectual projects of the Abbasid Caliphate was the Beit al-Hikmah, the House of Wisdom in Baghdad, where texts from Greek, Persian, Indian, and other traditions were translated and preserved. Much of what we know about ancient Greek science we know through Arabic translations of originals that were later destroyed. The chain of transmission is not lost, it is simply longer and less direct than we often acknowledge. But what is worth noting is that Al-Khazini describes building techniques, particularly techniques for cutting and fitting stone, that he attributes to a period and a people he describes obliquely, without naming. He says only that they were people who understood the weight of the world differently than his contemporaries did. This could be poetic language. This could be a reference to Greek or Persian predecessors. It could be. In the Inca tradition, the extraordinary stone structures of Sacsayhuaman, the fortress above Cuzco, whose walls incorporate stones weighing hundreds of tons fitted without mortar, are attributed in Spanish colonial accounts, partly to human labour, and partly, in the oral traditions the Spanish recorded, to an earlier people who were said to have known the stone. This phrase, appearing in multiple colonial-era transcriptions of oral accounts, is generally treated as mythological language, but as an engineering description, it is precise. To fit stone at that level, without error, without the ability to redo a cut once made in a multi-ton block, you would need an intimate and systematic understanding of how that specific stone behaves, its grain, its stress tolerances, its thermal expansion. You would need to know the stone. Return for a moment to the original image, a road, intact, beneath a modern city, 12 feet down, sealed and forgotten for 14 centuries. There are, according to the Museum of London, over 10,000 years of human occupation stratified beneath the City of London. The average depth of archaeological material is around 24 feet, which means that if you dig straight down beneath the centre of London, you pass through Victorian sewers, through Tudor foundations, through medieval cellars, through Saxon timber halls, through Roman streets, through Roman stone, and then, at some point, at a depth that varies by location, you reach a layer that is not attributed to any named civilization. In urban archaeology, this layer has a name. It is called the natural subsoil, and by definition, the natural subsoil contains nothing made by human hands. But the border between the bottom of the archaeological record and the top of the natural subsoil is not always clean. There are cases where shaped stones appear in positions that cannot be accounted for by any known occupation layer, cases where the distribution of materials suggests movement, suggests arrangement that has no clear explanation. These anomalies are usually interpreted as intrusions, stones that fell or were pushed down from a higher layer and came to rest in an apparent position that is misleading. The interpretation may be correct, it usually is, but the gap between this is most likely a natural intrusion, and this has been confirmed to be a natural intrusion, is a gap that, in salvage excavation conditions, frequently does not get closed. The project continues, the layer is covered, and so beneath the cities, a record exists, fragmentary, imprecise, discontinuous, of something very old that was built well and was not fully understood by the people who built on top of it. Here is the thought that this record leaves open. We generally understand history as a progressive accumulation. Humans began simple, grew complex. We built primitive shelters, then better shelters, then villages, then cities, then empires. The line runs forward. Each era stands on the previous era's shoulders, but the geological record of what lies beneath our cities does not obviously support a straight line. It supports a layered record, in which the oldest visible layer is sometimes the hardest to explain, the most precisely made, the most resistant to reproduction. It supports a record in which knowledge appears to arrive, to be present in a civilization, before the period that civilization would need to develop it from scratch. The official frameworks are not wrong to note that civilizations can achieve remarkable things through time, patience, and organizational will. They can, they have. The evidence for human ingenuity across history is overwhelming and should not be set aside. But it is worth asking, and asking seriously, without hysteria, without the need for a dramatic conclusion, whether the buildings we keep finding beneath our cities are evidence of a lineage we have not yet fully mapped, whether the stone road under London and the volcanic foundations under Ankara, and the fitted walls of Sacsayhuaman, and the self-reinforcing concrete of Roman harbours all point backward towards something that was doing what we think of as advanced, quietly, before the period we have assigned to it. We are very good at building on top of things. We are less practiced, perhaps, at looking down. The next time a city announces a new transit project, a new underground highway, a new utility corridor, it is worth noting, with genuine curiosity and no particular alarm, what they find when the machines break through, and whether the report will say what was discovered, or simply that the project continued on schedule.